Wake up, coffee, kids up, school run, work, pick up, dinner, dishes, scroll on the couch for 20 minutes, bed. Repeat tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. If you're watching this, you probably built this routine on purpose at some point because it worked. It got everyone where they needed to be. It kept the household running. And somewhere along the way, without either of you deciding it, this routine stopped being something you run and started being something that's quietly running you. Stay with me, because what I'm about to explain is exactly how a perfectly functional routine turns into the thing that's slowly emptying out a marriage, and what actually reverses it. Here's what almost nobody tells you about routine, and it's counterintuitive enough that it's worth sitting with. Routine isn't neutral. It's not just a scheduling tool that has no effect on the relationship itself. Routine actively shapes what your brain expects from your marriage, and once a routine has been in place long enough, your brain stops treating your spouse as someone to actively notice and starts treating them as a fixed, predictable feature of the environment, reliable in the same way a piece of furniture is reliable. That shift happens gradually and completely without malice, but it has enormous consequences. Because a fixed feature of the environment isn't something you actively appreciate or desire, it's just something that's there. This is the part that trips people up, because routine, on its face, looks like exactly the opposite of a problem. Routine means things run smoothly. It means less conflict, less chaos, less of the friction that comes from constantly renegotiating who does what. Most couples actively work to build routine, and for good reason. It genuinely reduces a certain kind of stress. But the same predictability that reduces friction is also, unfortunately, the exact thing that quietly starves the part of a relationship that depends on novelty, attention, and the sense that your partner is a whole person you're still actively getting to know, not a fully solved equation you've already figured out. Let's talk about what happens neurologically, in plain language, because understanding this changes how you interpret what's happening in your own marriage. The brain's reward systems respond most strongly to things that are uncertain, variable, or new. This is true for almost everything humans find compelling. It's why a predictable song gets boring after enough repetitions, why a familiar route home stops registering consciously, why the version of a person you've seen 10,000 times in the exact same context stops producing the same spark it did the first 100 times. This isn't a flaw in you or in your marriage. It's just how attention and reward work. The danger is that most couples never account for this, and they build a life together that's almost entirely composed of the predictable, repeated interactions that this system responds to least, while wondering why the spark seems to have quietly faded, despite nothing being technically wrong. Here's the specific trap that catches so many marriages. The routine you built to protect the relationship from chaos ends up protecting it right out of existence. When every day looks essentially like every other day, when the conversations you have with your spouse are almost entirely predictable in both content and timing, when you know exactly what tonight will look like before it happens because it looks exactly like every other night this month, you've built something extremely efficient, and something that's quietly starving the part of your connection that needs to occasionally be surprised, occasionally uncertain, occasionally reminded that this person is still capable of showing you something new. It's worth being honest about how this specifically shows up in daily life, because it's rarely dramatic. It looks like knowing exactly what your spouse is going to say before they say it, and being right almost every time. It looks like conversations that have narrowed down to a small, repeating set of topics: the schedule, the kids, a shared complaint about work, maybe a show you're both watching. Because anything outside that set requires more energy and attention than the routine leaves available. It looks like physical affection becoming almost entirely functional and habitual. The same goodnight kiss in the same spot, the same brief hug in the doorway, performed on autopilot rather than as an actual choice made in that moment. None of this feels dramatic when it's happening. That's exactly what makes it dangerous. Nothing about it registers as a crisis, because a crisis usually has a clear inciting incident, and this has none. It's simply erosion, one identical day at a time. Before I go further, I want to name something. Most people in this exact situation aren't doing anything crazy. They're just living inside a system that's really good at running a household and not particularly good at keeping a spark alive. Knowing exactly what your spouse will say before they say it, conversations narrowed down to logistics, affection running on autopilot, if any of that sounds familiar, you're not failing at your marriage. You just haven't had a way back in yet. That's actually why I put together the Reconnection Blueprint, a guide built specifically for exactly this. Not a crisis, just a slow flattening that's completely fixable once you know where to look, with concrete exercises you can start tonight. The link is in the first comment below. I'll come back to it before we're done. Now, let's talk about what's actually happening inside your brain when routine takes over, because this part changes how you'll read everything else in your marriage. It's also worth naming what happens to anticipation specifically, because anticipation is one of the most underrated ingredients in sustained romantic attraction, and routine quietly eliminates it almost entirely. In the early stages of a relationship, there's often a sense of looking forward to seeing your partner, wondering what tonight will be like, feeling a small flicker of anticipation before they walk through the door. Once a routine fully sets in, that anticipation tends to disappear. Not because you don't care anymore, but because there's genuinely nothing to anticipate. You already know exactly what tonight looks like. It looks like every other night. And a nervous system that already knows the outcome doesn't produce the same kind of anticipatory pull that uncertainty does. Here's something worth understanding about why couples resist changing a routine even once they notice this pattern. Because the resistance itself is completely rational and worth naming directly. Routine exists because it genuinely reduces cognitive and logistical load, especially for couples juggling work, kids, finances, and everything else that constitutes an adult life. Breaking from routine, even in small ways, requires energy and planning that feels genuinely scarce most days. This is why so many couples who intellectually understand that their routine has become a problem still don't change anything. Not because they don't care, but because the routine is load-bearing in a very real, practical sense. And disrupting it feels like it would create more stress rather than less, at least in the short term. This is exactly why the solution isn't abandoning routine altogether, which would be both impractical and unnecessary. The solution is far more targeted. Identifying the small number of specific moments in your week where predictability is actively costing you connection, and deliberately introducing variation only in those specific places, while leaving the rest of the load-bearing structure fully intact. You don't need to overhaul your entire life. You need to find the 2 or 3 places where sameness has quietly replaced presence, and change those specifically. One of the most effective places to start is simply the content of your conversations, independent of when or where they happen. If your conversations have narrowed down to logistics, work complaints, and whatever show you're watching, the fix isn't necessarily more time together. It's different questions inside the time you already have. Asking something you genuinely don't know the answer to, something that has nothing to do with the household's operational needs, reintroduces exactly the kind of uncertainty and novelty that routine has been quietly eliminating. This can feel oddly effortful at first, precisely because the habit of asking functional questions has become so automatic that anything else requires deliberate intention. Another high-leverage place to introduce variation is in how you spend time together outside of pure logistics, even in small ways. This doesn't require an elaborate date night, which many exhausted couples find themselves unable to sustain consistently anyway. It can be as simple as trying something neither of you has done before, even something small and low stakes. A different route on a walk, a new recipe attempted together, a conversation held somewhere other than the usual spot on the couch. The specific activity matters less than the fact that neither of you already knows exactly how it's going to go, because that uncertainty is doing real psychological work, reactivating the part of your attention that routine has quietly put to sleep. It's also worth being intentional about physical affection specifically, separating out the habitual, functional touch from touch that's a genuine, present moment choice. This doesn't mean abandoning the quick goodbye kiss or the habitual hug. Those still matter, and eliminating them wouldn't help anything. It means occasionally, deliberately, adding touch that has no functional trigger attached to it at all. Reaching for your partner's hand for no logistical reason. Initiating a longer embrace on an ordinary Tuesday for no occasion. Touch whose only purpose is communicating, "I'm choosing to be close to you right now." Not because we're saying goodbye or because it's bedtime, but simply because I wanted to. There's also real value in occasionally breaking the routine's rhythm just slightly, in ways that create a small amount of anticipation during the day. A brief, unexpected message sent in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, not about logistics, just because you were thinking about them, reintroduces a tiny amount of the anticipation that used to exist naturally before routine flattened it out. These are small interventions, almost absurdly small when you say them out loud. But their smallness is exactly why they're sustainable. You're not trying to recreate the intensity of the earliest days of the relationship, which isn't realistic or even necessarily desirable given everything else you're both managing. You're trying to reintroduce small, regular doses of the uncertainty and attention that routine has been steadily removing. It's worth acknowledging honestly that this kind of change often feels awkward before it feels natural, especially in a marriage that's been running the same pattern for years. Asking an unusual question, initiating unscheduled affection, trying something new together. All of it can feel slightly performative or forced the first several times, precisely because you're deliberately introducing something the routine had trained you both out of. That awkwardness is a completely normal part of rebuilding a muscle that atrophied through years of prioritizing efficiency. And it fades far faster than most couples expect once the new pattern starts to feel less like an intervention and more like a genuine part of how you relate to each other again. There's also something worth naming about who typically notices this pattern first in a marriage, because it's rarely both partners simultaneously. Usually, one partner starts to feel the flatness before the other does, and raising it can feel risky, because from the other partner's perspective, everything might genuinely seem fine. The routine is working. The household is functioning. Nothing looks broken. This is exactly why the conversation needs to be framed around the pattern itself, rather than around blame. Something like, "I've noticed our days have gotten really predictable, and I don't think that's a bad thing exactly, but I think I miss feeling surprised by you sometimes, and I want us to bring some of that back." That framing invites collaboration, rather than triggering defensiveness, because it names a shared, fixable pattern, rather than accusing anyone of letting the marriage go stale. Where this leaves you, right now, sitting inside a routine that runs smoothly and feels strangely hollow at the same time, is somewhere genuinely fixable, even though it might not feel that way yet. The good news buried inside this entire pattern is that the flatness you're feeling isn't evidence that something is fundamentally wrong between you. It's evidence that a system built for efficiency has quietly squeezed out the specific ingredients: novelty, curiosity, anticipation, that keep a long-term relationship feeling alive rather than merely functional. Those ingredients aren't gone forever. They've just been crowded out by a schedule that never left room for them. And making room again doesn't require blowing up the life you've built. It requires a handful of small, deliberate changes in the specific places where sameness quietly took over. Everything we've talked about today is the diagnosis. You now understand why a perfectly functioning routine can quietly flatten a marriage, and why nothing about it ever looks like a crisis until it's been running for years. But understanding the pattern is only half of it. The other half is having an exact way back in. Not vague advice like spend more time together, but a specific method for finding the 2 or 3 places where sameness replaced presence and rebuilding from there. That's exactly what the Reconnection Blueprint gives you. A set of reconnection principles, each with a same-day exercise you can start tonight. Nothing theoretical, nothing that requires overhauling your entire life. The link is in the first comment below. Go check it out the moment this video ends. Before we end today, here's the one thing I want you to take with you. A marriage that runs like clockwork isn't automatically a marriage that's thriving. Sometimes the smoothest running routines are the ones doing the most damage, precisely because nothing about them ever announces itself as a problem. The fix isn't chaos, and it isn't abandoning the structure that keeps your life functioning. It's finding the small handful of places where predictability replaced presence, and choosing, deliberately, to be surprising to each other again, even in tiny ways. Starting with something as simple as one unexpected question tonight, instead of the same conversation you already know by heart.